Why would anyone spend their life working for someone else? Money can't buy respect. You really believe that?
Tell me something. How would you fix the freight bottleneck on the south side?
The bottleneck isn't the warehouse, it's the timing system feeding the warehouse. If you stagger inbound schedules by 23 minutes, the entire corridor clears itself.
Who are you?
They stole everything from him. They buried a genius.
The man you called a driver just saved this company $40 million. He was never just a driver.
Nobody inside that five-star hotel lobby believed the black man in the worn driver's uniform had once saved a company from collapse with a single plan. To every person who swept past him that evening, Malcolm Reed was nothing more than a single father driving a car for hire, standing beside a black Maybach like a shadow without a name. Then Von Mercer laughed in front of the assembled crowd. "Why drive for him? Don't you have any pride left?" Malcolm said nothing. But behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, high on the penthouse level, billionaire Dorian Blake had heard every word. And that was the moment he decided to change Malcolm Reed's life forever. But before that truth could surface, Malcolm would have to survive the most humiliating night of his entire life. The night had begun the way most nights began for Malcolm Reed. Quietly, professionally, without ceremony. Chicago's Ritz-Carlton blazed against the November sky, its entrance lined with black-town cars and valets in pressed white gloves. And Malcolm had pulled the Maybach into position at 7 minutes past 6, exactly 4 minutes ahead of the agreed arrival time. He wore the same charcoal gray driver's uniform he'd worn every evening for the past 14 months. Not because he lacked other clothes, but because he understood that in this world, presentation was armor, and he intended to wear his armor well. The lobby doors spilled warm amber light onto the sidewalk, and through the glass he could see the kind of people who had never once considered what it cost to build the infrastructure that carried their world forward. The logistics networks, the delivery chains, the silent architecture of movement that kept their products stocked and their lives frictionless. They moved in and out of the light with the ease of people who had never had to think about what made ease possible. And Malcolm watched them with the particular attention of a man who understood the system they were standing on top of, down to its load-bearing joints. Cole Whitaker appeared at Malcolm's elbow before the first guests even arrived, clipboard in hand and a look on his face that suggested he had been waiting all evening for a reason to remind Malcolm of his place. Cole was the fleet manager for Blake Meridian Holdings, a man who had spent 11 years building the kind of authority that comes not from talent but from proximity to powerful people, and he wore that borrowed authority like a man who knew it might be revoked at any moment. He handed Malcolm a checklist, wiped down the rear door handles, checked the tire pressure again, confirmed the interior temperature. Tasks that any valet could have completed in 3 minutes, tasks that Cole had invented specifically to keep Malcolm occupied and visible in his subordinate role. Malcolm took the clipboard without expression, completed every item with methodical precision, and handed it back without making eye contact, because making eye contact with Cole's theater was the one response that would give it the status it was reaching for. The other drivers knew better than to engage, but a few of the younger valets snickered among themselves, and Malcolm heard the whispers moving through the cold November air. The charity case, Blake's pet project. Did you hear he used to be somebody? He had learned long ago that silence in these moments was not weakness. It was economy, a conservation of energy for battles worth fighting, and a refusal to let other people's need to diminish him become the story of the evening. He had also learned, at a cost that could not be precisely denominated, that the people who needed to narrate someone else's fall were almost always people who were terrified of their own. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, and he stepped 3 paces away from the car to answer it. A brief call from the woman who watched his daughter on long evenings, confirming that dinner was finished and homework was done and everything at home was as it should be. He said what he always said, "I'm good, tell her I'll be home before midnight," Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to his post beside the Maybach, where the city's cold moved around him without acknowledgement. Dorian Blake emerged from the lobby at 7:42, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who had long since stopped performing for anyone's benefit. He was 52 years old, dark-complexioned, with close-cropped silver at his temples, and the kind of stillness around him that made rooms go quiet without his saying a word. He ran Blake Meridian Holdings, a conglomerate with interests in commercial real estate, regional freight, and urban infrastructure, and he had built it across the decades when people who looked like him were told, politely and not so politely, that the table they wanted a seat at was full. He paused at the top of the hotel steps, scanned the street with the efficiency of a man who evaluated things for a living, and when his gaze found Malcolm, it did not slide past the way most people's did. Cole started toward him with some managerial function prepared, but Dorian cut the approach off without looking at him and walked directly to where Malcolm stood. "You know this city's South Side Freight Corridor?" The phrasing was not quite a question. Malcolm felt the register shift. This was not small talk, this was assessment, and he answered without hesitation, walking through the main choke points at the rail interchange. The single-lane bottleneck near the cold storage cluster on South Halstead, the timing failure with inbound freight that produced cascade delays every Tuesday and Thursday because no one with authority over the schedule had ever actually driven the route. Dorian listened without moving, with the complete attention of a man who distinguishes between people who know a subject and people who know its literature. When Malcolm finished, Dorian was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he turned toward the hotel entrance and said nothing further, and Malcolm opened the rear door and watched him go, and Cole stood a few feet away pretending he had not heard a word, and something had shifted in the air between them that Malcolm could feel the way a man who has spent years reading terrain can feel a change in the ground beneath his feet. An hour into the gala, Dorian's assistant relayed a request through the earpiece Malcolm wore on duty. "Mr. Blake needed the blue-jacketed briefing folder from the locked console in the rear compartment, and he needed it brought upstairs personally." Malcolm confirmed, retrieved the folder, and made his way through the side entrance that staff used to access the main event floor. The elevator opened onto a hall of gold-lit chandeliers and floor-length gowns, the assembled leadership of Chicago's financial and logistics world in its finest dress, and Malcolm moved through it the way he always moved through spaces that weren't designed for him. Directly, quietly, with the folder held in one hand and his eyes on the destination. He did not get far before the first ripple moved through the crowd. A woman near the bar leaning toward her companion, a man in a steel blue suit slowing his stride slightly, as though verifying what he thought he was seeing, the small social machinery of a room deciding what category to put him in. He had been on the floor for less than 90 seconds when he heard his name said, not as a greeting but as a statement of surprise. The way you say a name when you encounter something out of context and need a moment to resolve the dissonance. Vaughn Mercer was 39 years old, the chief executive of Mercer Crown Logistics, a company he had built partly on ambition and partly on the ruins of other people's work. He was handsome in the way that men are handsome when they have spent considerable money on the appearance of effortlessness, and he had a voice calibrated by years of boardrooms and benefit dinners to carry exactly as far as he intended it to carry. He recognized Malcolm in the same instant Malcolm recognized him, and the flicker that moved across his face was not guilt. Guilt would have required him to believe he had done something wrong, but a kind of cold amusement, the amusement of a man who has just been handed an unexpected opportunity to perform for an audience he values. Reagan Holloway was standing 3 feet from Vaughn, holding a glass of sparkling water and wearing the expression of someone who had already rehearsed her reaction to this encounter, without realizing she had done so. She and Malcolm had known each other years earlier, before the collapse of everything Malcolm had built, back when he had been the kind of man that people like Reagan considered promising. The word promising, Malcolm had come to understand, was the word people used when they intended to reserve judgment, when they wanted to keep you close enough to benefit from if you succeeded. but at enough distance to disavow you if you didn't. She looked at him now with something that was trying to be warmth, but landing closer to embarrassment, and she said, "Malcolm. Are you? Are you actually driving for Mr. Blake?" She said it as though the question were neutral, but the pause before it told a different story. Vaughn did not wait for Malcolm to answer. He turned slightly toward the small cluster of people nearby and spoke at a volume precisely designed to be overheard without appearing to be a declaration. "Why drive for him?" he said. "I genuinely want to understand it. A man with your supposed background, your supposed experience. Don't you find it beneath you? Standing in the cold, opening doors for someone else?" There was laughter, light and cocktail hour easy. The kind that doesn't commit to cruelty but doesn't refuse it either. The kind that exists in rooms where the social cost of abstaining is higher than the social cost of participating. Malcolm stood with the folder at his side and looked at Vaughn for a long moment, not with anger and not with wounded pride, but with the kind of attention a man pays when he is committing something to memory. "An honest job doesn't shame me," Malcolm said. The room held a beat of quiet. Vaughn smiled with his teeth and said that Malcolm had always been good at sounding dignified, that it was one of the things he remembered about him from the old days, right up until the day everything fell apart, and the people who had trusted his judgment paid for it. The implication was precise, that Malcolm's fall had been a consequence rather than an injustice, that beneath the composure was a man who had failed and was now surviving on borrowed grace, dressed in someone else's uniform, kept employed by a benefactor too charitable to look closely at what he was keeping. Malcolm said nothing further. He delivered the folder to Dorian's assistant and walked back to the elevator, carrying the weight of Vaughn's performance the way he carried most weight, without showing it on the outside, and without pretending it wasn't there. On the 48th floor, in a private room overlooking the lit grid of the city, Dorian Blake stood at the window with a small security receiver in his hand. The briefing folder Malcolm had delivered carried a standard communications chip for handling sensitive documents in transit, and he replayed what he had just heard and felt the specific quality of certainty that comes when a long calculation resolves exactly as expected. The drive back from the Ritz-Carlton that night took 40 minutes through light traffic, and Dorian spent the first 20 in the silence that Malcolm had learned, across 14 months, was not absence but attention, a deliberate clearing of space to allow the world to show him what it would. When Dorian finally spoke, it was without preamble. "You worked at a freight company on the South Side about 6 years ago. The one that went under." Malcolm's hands stayed steady on the wheel. "Triton Regional Distribution," he said. Dorian said, "You wrote the consolidation plan." It was not a question, and Malcolm understood that it had never been a question, that it was instead the beginning of an accounting that Dorian had been waiting to conduct in the right conditions. The story of Triton had a shape that Malcolm had spent years trying not to trace, because every time he traced it, he arrived at the same place. The realization that in the world he had inhabited then, the outcome had never really been in his control. He had joined Triton at 32, carrying 8 years of freight routing experience and a mind that processed network inefficiencies the way other people processed music. Intuitively, structurally, with an almost physical sense of where the dissonance was. The company was bleeding $3 million annually in avoidable costs, redundant cold storage contracts, last-mile routes that folded back on themselves, a fuel billing arrangement that was either spectacularly mismanaged or quietly fraudulent. Malcolm had spent 4 months constructing a consolidation framework that would have cut those losses by 60% and positioned Triton to compete for city contracts. It was currently losing to larger firms with less efficient operations. He had submitted the framework to his department director. The director had presented it to the executive team without Malcolm's name attached. For approximately 6 weeks, the plan was praised and rewarded as evidence of leadership vision, and Malcolm had told himself that this was the cost of being new in a room, that credit would come. Then a group with commercial interests in Triton's existing vendor relationships began applying external pressure. Contracts were renegotiated in ways that violated the framework's structural logic, and when the resulting instability damaged two major client relationships, the executive team needed someone to absorb the consequence. The director pointed at Malcolm's original analysis, or rather, at the fragments of it, that had been stripped of context to look like the source of the problem rather than its solution. Malcolm was released without severance, with a notation in his file describing his contributions as unworkable. He drove and told Dorian the outline of it, the facts, not the grief, not the mornings at 4 in the dark, wondering which version of himself was real. Just the operational sequence, what the plan had contained, how it had been taken, what had followed, and the specific detail that Von Mercer had entered the picture shortly after, acquiring Triton's most valuable warehouse licenses in a distressed asset sale, at a price that only made sense if someone had known in advance that those assets were about to come available. Malcolm had noticed this. He had not been able to prove the chain. When he finished, Dorian was quiet for another mile, and then he said, "If you rebuilt that framework today, where would you start differently?" And Malcolm, without calculation, without the performance of competence for an evaluator's benefit, began to talk about what his original model had gotten right and what it had gotten fragile, about how urban freight networks were changing as smaller independent operators entered the market, about the specific failure modes that came from trying to optimize a system whose participants didn't trust each other enough to share real data. He talked for 11 minutes. He barely noticed the silence behind him until Dorian said, very quietly, "All right." When the Maybach stopped in front of Dorian's building, Dorian sat for a moment before opening the door. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "don't wear the uniform." Malcolm turned to look at him, which was something he almost never did while on duty. Dorian's face gave nothing away, but there was something in the economy of the instruction, its precision, its smallness, that felt less like a courtesy and more like the first deliberate move in something that had already been decided. Malcolm said, "Yes, sir," and he sat in the parked car for a moment longer than necessary, the city humming softly around him, and something that had been still for a very long time began very quietly to move. Blake Meridian Holdings occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower on West Monroe, and on the morning that Malcolm Reed walked through its lobby in his own clothes, dark trousers, a collared shirt, a jacket he had kept pressed out of habit, he was operating under the assumption that he was walking toward a termination meeting. He had run the logic of it through the night. The scene at the gala had been embarrassing. It had put Dorian in an uncomfortable position by association, and ending the arrangement professionally and without further spectacle would be the sensible resolution for everyone involved. He had prepared himself for this, the way he prepared for most things he couldn't control, by deciding in advance how he would carry himself through it, so that whatever happened on the other side of the door could not take anything from him that he hadn't already chosen to place within reach. Tessa Holloway met him on the 31st floor and led him past the open-plan operations floor and into a smaller conference room, where 3 large monitors displayed route maps, warehouse cluster diagrams, and a cost model rendered in red and black that Malcolm recognized immediately as a freight acquisition analysis. Dorian was already there, seated at the far end of the table with a single printed document in front of him, and he looked up when Malcolm entered and said without greeting, "Blake Meridian is evaluating a regional acquisition. 14 operating facilities, mixed cold and ambient, covering the corridor between Indianapolis and Detroit. The advisory team has modeled the integration at $40 million over 3 years. I believe the number is wrong." He slid the document toward the chair to his left, which Malcolm understood was an instruction to sit. Through the glass wall of the conference room, Cole Whitaker was visible in the corridor with his arms crossed, watching with an expression that had not yet decided whether to be contemptuous or alarmed. Malcolm sat and looked at the document. It was a standard acquisition summary, revenue projections, asset valuations, integration cost schedules, and within 90 seconds he was seeing it. The thing that did not fit, the seam where something had been averaged when it needed to be disaggregated. He turned to the monitor on his left without asking permission and began working through the route data. cross-referencing delivery windows against facility operating hours, checking the fuel cost line items against publicly available regional price indices, following the logic of the model to where it strained. What he found, and what he laid out in plain language over the next 40 minutes, was a set of interlocking problems that the advisory team had either failed to detect or declined to surface. 3 of the 14 facilities being maintained as operational, when their actual throughput marked them as warehousing liabilities. A fuel contract attached to the acquisition containing an escalation clause that would add an estimated $7 million to operating costs in years 2 and 3, buried in an appendix written to require 5 reference documents to fully decode, and delivery time data for the southern routes, averaged in a way that concealed chronic underperformance, making a fragile network look reliable. He said all of this without raising his voice, without drama, pointing at figures on the screen with the quiet confidence of a man who is not making an argument but reporting what he sees. Tessa had moved from the doorway to the chair nearest the monitors without appearing to notice herself doing it. When Malcolm finished, the room held its silence. Tessa said, "How long did it take you to find the fuel clause?" Malcolm said, 20 minutes. The throughput numbers I'd want to verify against physical records before I'd stake anything formal on them. Dorian, who had not moved during the entire presentation, said, "You have 24 hours. Prepare a summary. 1 page. Plain language." He stood and left the room, and Tessa looked at Malcolm with an expression that had shifted substantially from where it had been an hour earlier, and Cole Whitaker, visible through the glass wall, had uncrossed his arms and was looking at his phone with the focused attention of a man making a decision. Word moved through Blake Meridian, the way word always moves through organizations where information is power, selectively, with embellishment, and faster than anyone officially intended. By the afternoon of Malcolm's second day in the building, the story had been translated from Dorian. Asked the driver to look at a document, to the driver is doing the advisory team's job, and the translation was not neutral. It landed differently depending on who received it, and for the people who had built their standing over years of careful positioning, it landed as a question about whether the criteria they had been evaluated against were the criteria that actually mattered. Cole Whitaker took the story and sharpened it, deploying in corridor conversations and casual asides the suggestion that Malcolm was a performance, a man who had learned to tell a compelling story about himself, who had found a benefactor willing to believe it, and who was now maneuvering to convert that credulity into position and compensation he had not earned through the channels everyone else had to use. Cole had enough institutional credibility in the logistics division to make this reading stick for people who hadn't watched Malcolm work, and he deployed it with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly what he was protecting. He also, that evening, sent a message to a number that Malcolm would not have recognized. Vaughn Mercer received it and processed it with the particular attention he reserved for threats that had begun to move faster than expected. The freight acquisition under review was one in which Vaughn had a commercial interest, not as a disclosed party, which would have created legal obligations, but as a beneficiary of the surrounding structure, a structure whose layered complexity had been designed specifically to obscure that relationship. If Malcolm's analysis surfaced the fuel escalation clause and the throughput misrepresentation, it would not stop there. It would pull threads that connected back to the Triton years, and Vaughn understood what would be found at the end of those threads. He called Cole back that night. Cole's contribution was precise and targeted. He accessed the digital briefing package that had been prepared for Malcolm's review and modified 3 sets of throughput numbers. Small adjustments, well within the range of what could be explained as routine data entry variation, but enough to redirect Malcolm's analysis toward the wrong conclusion if he used them as his foundation. He replaced the file in the shared drive and closed his laptop, operating on the assumption that a man who had spent 14 months driving a car would not have the instinct to cross-check digital source data against physical records. Malcolm had the instinct. He had been working from the digital files for the first hour, when something in the throughput numbers struck him as slightly off, not obviously wrong, but off in the way that a sentence is off when one word has been substituted for another that almost fits, close enough to pass a quick reading, but wrong enough to snag on sustained attention. He went back to the physical route logs that Tessa had provided as background material and compared them against the digital data, and found the discrepancy. 3 facilities, 3 sets of numbers, and a file modification timestamp that post-dated the original creation by 31 hours. He did not report this immediately. He printed both versions, labeled them carefully, set them aside, and completed 2 parallel analyses, one built on the modified figures, one on the originals, with a single additional page documenting the discrepancy, its location, and its material effect on the conclusions. Then he worked until 2 in the morning, checking and rechecking, because he wanted to be exact. When Tessa stopped by the small office they'd given him to use the following afternoon, he showed her the 2 versions side by side. She looked at the modification timestamp without speaking. Then she said, "Why didn't you flag this immediately?" He said, "Because whoever changed this didn't act alone. If I walk into Dorian's office with a complaint about a file, I've shown my hand to half the problem. I need to know the full shape before I do anything with it." Tessa sat back slowly, and in the recalibration that moved across her face, Malcolm could see the exact moment when she stopped thinking of him as a variable in someone else's equation and started thinking of him as a person worth standing next to. The pitching session was scheduled for a Thursday morning on the 50th floor, in a room with floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides and a conference table, long enough to seat 22 people without crowding. The attendees included Blake Meridian's senior partners, 3 outside investors, 2 attorneys representing different interests in the acquisition structure, and, by an apparent coincidence that Malcolm recognized immediately as deliberate arrangement, Von Mercer, included as a consultant nominally representing one of the infrastructure entities associated with the deal. Malcolm arrived early, placed his materials at the seat Dorian's assistant had designated for him, and noted that his positioning at the table put him directly across from where Vaughn would sit. He arranged his 2 sets of documents, white paper and pale yellow, in a specific order, facing down, and he sat with his hands flat on the table and waited. Vaughn's entrance produced the session's first significant moment. He walked in with the practiced ease of a man who had inhabited rooms like this one for 2 decades, distributed handshakes among the attorneys and nods among the investors, and then looked across the table at Malcolm with an expression that was nearly perfectly controlled. Nearly, because Vaughn had been performing composure long enough that his composure had a texture, and Malcolm had had years to learn what genuine ease looked like. "I see Blake Meridian has expanded its table," Vaughn said, in the pleasant register of a man making a social observation designed to land as something else. "When did the drivers start sitting in on acquisition reviews?" One of the investors gave a diplomatic laugh. Dorian, at the head of the table, did not respond. Malcolm opened his folder. Vaughn presented first, and he was formidable. Polished, fluent, moving through his acquisition model with the velocity and confidence of someone who had learned exactly how much a room of powerful people wants to hear before they stop listening and start agreeing. The graphics were excellent. The narrative was clean, and the investors watched him with the engaged attention of people being told what they had hoped to hear. He made no reference to the fuel escalation clause. He made no reference to the throughput data. He used the modified figures from Cole's altered files as though they were uncontested fact, and the presentation's logic flowed from them smoothly, because it had been built on them. When it was Malcolm's turn, he did not stand. He placed his 2 sets of documents on the table and said, in a level voice, "I'd like to start with a small administrative matter, because it affects how everything else in this room should be understood," he explained, in exact and unemotional language, that the digital briefing package distributed for this session had been altered after its original creation, that the specific alterations affected 3 facility throughput, set central to the model's projected profitability, and that he had a modification log with its timestamp available for anyone who wished to examine it. He placed the log in the center of the table. He said he had completed his analysis using the original unaltered figures, and that the results were materially different from what had just been presented. The room's temperature changed in a way that was almost physical. Vaughn said, with controlled evenness, that data variation of this kind was routine in a document traveling through multiple review cycles. Malcolm agreed that this was true, and said that the timestamp showed the alteration had occurred 11 minutes after the file was last accessed by a user whose credentials belonged to the Fleet Operations Division, a division with no formal role in acquisition analysis. He did not say Cole's name. He laid out his actual findings next. The fuel escalation clause, reproduced and annotated in plain language. The 3 facilities whose corrected throughput data made them acquisition liabilities rather than assets. And a network map showing how the deal, as structured, would transfer approximately $9 million in hidden liability to Blake Meridian within 18 months. He also noted, without accusation but with specificity, that the pattern of misrepresentation in the data bore a close structural resemblance to the manipulation that had preceded the collapse of Triton Regional Distribution 6 years prior, and that Triton's primary warehouse licenses had subsequently been acquired at distressed asset pricing by an entity with undisclosed ties to the consulting firm Von Mercer had used to evaluate that transaction. For a period that felt considerably longer than it was, no one spoke. One of the attorneys was writing steadily. Vaughn's expression had not broken. He was too experienced for that. But something behind it had shifted in a way the room could feel without being able to name. Tessa, seated against the wall, held very still. Dorian sat at the head of the table, with the patience of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment, and sees no reason to rush it now that it has arrived. Then he said, Blake Meridian retained an independent auditor to shadow this acquisition from its first filing. What Mr. Reed has presented this morning is consistent with that auditor's preliminary report. The acquisition is suspended pending formal review, and this session will be included in the legal documentation that follows. He let the room absorb this. The man many of you have been calling a driver, he said, with the measured weight of a man who chooses his words with precision, just protected this company from a $40 million mistake. In the hours that followed, the room emptied the way rooms empty when something has gone irreversibly wrong for some of the people in them. Quickly, with the performance of normalcy, everyone recalibrating in real time who they should now be seen standing near. Reagan Holloway found Malcolm near the elevator bank and said his name in the careful, softened register of someone who has been composing an apology in her head and is now discovering that the words don't carry the weight she intended them to. Malcolm listened. He gave her his full attention, which was more than she had given him. On the evening she had stood beside Vaughn and laughed, and when she finished he told her he appreciated her words and left it at that. Not cold, not warm, just precise, because he had learned at considerable cost that some apologies come from genuine reckoning, and some come from the discomfort of being on the wrong side of history, and he did not yet know which this was. Dorian found him in the borrowed office an hour later and closed the door behind him. He said, "You've been patient. You deserve an explanation." What followed was the accounting Malcolm had tried not to expect and had tried not to want, because wanting it had felt like the kind of vulnerability that cost more than it yielded. Dorian told him that he had first encountered Malcolm's name 7 years earlier, attached to a technical paper on urban freight consolidation that had circulated briefly in a professional network before being removed. Taken down, apparently, by the same director who had presented Malcolm's Triton framework as his own creation. Dorian had tracked the paper to its source and found nothing but the document itself, a name and a trail that ended in professional erasure. When Malcolm had appeared in a background check 3 years later, listed as an independent driver available for hire, Dorian had made a note and waited for the right conditions. The decision to bring Malcolm on directly had been deliberate and, Dorian acknowledged without evasion, imperfect. He had needed to verify that the qualities evident in the paper had survived the years of damage done to Malcolm's standing, that they had not been replaced by bitterness, or by the specific hollowness that comes when a person has been treated as less than they are, for long enough that they begin to extend the world's low estimate some credibility. The driver's position had offered proximity without obligation, a way to observe without creating the pressure of expectation. "I didn't do it to test your pride," Dorian said. "I did it because I needed to know whether the man who wrote that paper was still in you. He was. He never left." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. He said that he understood the reasoning and could respect its logic, but that there was a version of being watched without knowing it that sat uncomfortably close to the way he had been managed at Triton. Assessed by criteria he wasn't told, evaluated by standards he couldn't contest. And he wanted to say that plainly, without its being taken as something it was not. Dorian said, "It's not ingratitude. It's the right observation. And it's exactly what I needed to know that you were still capable of making." He placed a single document on the desk, a project outline for a new operational initiative within Blake Meridian, focused on building free network access and contract capacity for small independent operators, the kind of businesses owned by people who had been systematically excluded from the commercial logistics market by capital requirements, institutional bias, and the information asymmetry that compounds every other disadvantage. Malcolm would lead it, with a title, a budget, a team, and full operational authority. The project already had a name, the Reed Urban Freight Initiative. Malcolm read it twice and said he needed a night to think. Dorian said, "Take it." He sat at the kitchen table of his apartment that night, with the document beside a cup of coffee that went cold while he read, the box of work notes from the Triton years open on the floor at his feet. The notes were dense and precise. Route analyses, cost models, 2 separate network design frameworks he had developed in the years after Triton and never shown anyone, because showing them would have required explaining their origin. And explaining their origin meant reopening something in a public way that had never seemed worth what it would cost. He read through them with the eyes he had now, rather than the eyes he'd had when he wrote them. And he found that they were sound, not perfect, but grounded in the kind of structural thinking that the industry's best work required, and alive with the intelligence of someone who had never stopped turning the problems over, even when the problems had no practical outlet. His daughter appeared in the kitchen doorway, still half asleep, on her way for a glass of water, and she stopped and looked at him the way teenagers look at a parent who is visibly carrying something. She asked if he was all right. He said yes, and then, because she was old enough to hear the gap in that answer, "I'm deciding whether to go back to something that hurt me, because I think what I can do there might matter." She considered this for a moment with the quiet seriousness he had always appreciated in her. "Does it feel different this time?" she said. He said, "Yeah, it does." She nodded and went back to bed, and Malcolm sat with her question in the stillness of the apartment, which was its own kind of answer. The next morning he returned to Blake Meridian and told Dorian he would accept the position, but with 3 conditions that needed to be explicit before any agreement was signed. The project could not function as a public relations instrument, not for the firm's diversity metrics, not as a story about philanthropy, not as a narrative in which wealthy people rescued people without power. It had to be operationally real, genuine contracts, genuine training infrastructure, genuine equity in the network access it built for the people it served. Second, those people had to be involved in the project's design from the beginning, not consulted after the structure was already fixed and the important choices already made. Third, Malcolm's name went on the work, publicly, permanently, not buried in acknowledgments or quietly replaced in presentations, but on the project itself from the first day to the last. Dorian looked at him for a measured moment. Then he said, "Those were the conditions I was waiting for you to name." He explained that 2 provisions in the document had been deliberately left underspecified, that a man who accepted a generous offer without scrutinizing its terms was a man who would let the offer define him, and that was not the leader the initiative required. Malcolm said, without heat, "I noticed the gaps." Dorian allowed himself a brief expression that in another man might have been a smile, and for a moment the distance between them, which had always been exact and professional and appropriate, felt like the distance between 2 people who have understood each other at the level that matters. 3 months after the pitching session, Blake Meridian hosted the formal launch of the Reed Urban Freight Initiative in a ballroom on the 48th floor, and the guest list included the 50 founding operators selected for the program's first cycle. They were independent drivers, small fleet owners, a woman who had been running a refrigerated produce route out of her own truck for 6 years without contract protection, a man who had been trying to obtain a warehouse license for 4 years and kept encountering the same institutional wall. They wore their best clothes and held their folders with the particular wariness of people who had learned not to trust rooms like this one, until the room had given them a reason to. And Malcolm had insisted that the event structure begin with them, their names, their operations, their plans, before any executive said a word. Cole Whitaker had been terminated following the internal review that Tessa's documentation had triggered. The process had been thorough and private, as these processes generally are, and Cole had departed without public statement, which was the outcome that best served everyone's interest in having the matter resolved rather than performed. Vaughn Mercer had fared significantly worse. The auditor's report, combined with the thread that Malcolm's Triton analysis had reintroduced into formal inquiry, had produced 3 civil proceedings and a regulatory investigation that his attorneys were now managing at considerable and compounding expense. He had not attended the launch. He had not been invited. Reagan Holloway was there, in a seat near the back of the room, having requested an invitation through the firm's public affairs process. She watched the proceedings from a polite distance and did not attempt to speak to Malcolm before the program began. He saw her when he walked to the front of the room to address the 50 operators, and he gave her the same nod he gave everyone else. Acknowledging without diminishing, without the performance of either warmth or coldness, that would have made his reaction about himself rather than about the work. A journalist from a logistics trade publication asked Malcolm, after the formal presentations, how it felt to have moved from driving a car to leading a multi-million-dollar initiative. Malcolm said, "I didn't change. The position I'm standing in changed. There's a difference between becoming something new and finally being seen for what was already there." The journalist wrote it down and looked up and said it was a good line. Malcolm said it wasn't a line. Dorian stood at the back of the room for the duration of the event, declined the chair that Tessa offered, and watched with the focused attention of a man who has invested himself in something, and is watching to see whether the investment has the quality he believed it had. He made 2 brief remarks at the close of the program and said nothing about his own role in creating it. Afterward, standing with Malcolm near the windows while the room moved around them, he said, "How does it feel to be inside this time?" Malcolm looked at the 50 operators still talking, still holding the folders that contained their first guaranteed contracts, still, some of them, not quite believing that the terms were real. "Like something that should have happened a long time ago," he said. "But I'll take it now." The Reed Urban Freight Initiative's first cycle placed all 50 operators into active contracts within 90 days. 11 of the 50 had previously been told, by institutions and advisors, and the accumulating logic of a system designed to protect what it had already distributed, that they lacked the qualifications for commercial freight agreements. None of them had lacked the qualifications. 6 weeks after the launch, Malcolm drove himself, not in a Maybach, not in a fleet vehicle, but in his own practical dark blue sedan that he kept clean out of old habit, to the Ritz-Carlton on East Pearson to sign a freight coordination agreement with the hotel's operational management team. The property director shook his hand with professional cordiality and showed no sign of recognition. Malcolm had recognized the property director. He had sat with that recognition quietly, the way he had learned to sit with many things, and when the paperwork was done he had shaken hands again and walked back through the lobby without ceremony, because the moment did not need to be performed to be real. He was nearly at the exterior door when the parking attendant, the same young man who had worked the south entrance on the night of the gala 14 months earlier, whose expression that evening had carried its own small register of dismissal, looked up and said, with a visible fumble of recalibration, "Mr. Reed?" Malcolm stopped. The young man said, with the sincere awkwardness of someone who wants to say something and has not quite found the words, I saw the announcement. About the initiative, Malcolm said. Good. He said it without sharpness, without the weight of everything he was choosing not to attach to those two syllables, and he walked through the door. Dorian was outside, having arrived separately for a different meeting in the building. He fell into step with Malcolm on the sidewalk, and they walked for half a block in the easy silence that had become the characteristic register of their working relationship. Dorian said, "They used to ask the wrong question." Malcolm said, "They asked why." Dorian said, "The question was always who." They stopped at the corner. Malcolm looked back at the hotel entrance, where a line of cars waited and a cluster of drivers stood in the cold in their uniforms, holding their positions with the practiced patience that the work required. The same patience Malcolm had held for 14 months, in the same cold, in the same clothes, in front of the same building. He looked at them the way a man looks at a road he has walked and can now see whole. Its length, its grade, what it had asked of him, what it had not been able to take. He had not been saved, and he wanted to be precise about this in his own understanding, because the distinction mattered to who he was and to the work he was going to do. A man who has been saved owes a debt to his rescuer, and his story becomes the story of that rescue. And that was not the story of what had happened. What had happened was that a man with the right eyes had looked in the right direction at the right moment, and a talent that had been buried by circumstance rather than destroyed by it had been allowed to surface and do what it had always been capable of doing. The work in the pitching room had been his. The years of driving, of keeping his mind sharp and his character intact, while the world organized itself around a low estimate of him, that had been his. The door had been Dorian's. But the man who walked through it had never stopped being himself, and that was the only fact that had ever truly mattered. He turned from the hotel entrance, walked to his car, and got in. He adjusted the mirror, pulled out into the late afternoon traffic of a city he had spent years learning from the inside out, and drove forward. No uniform, no deference, no one waiting for him to open a door that was not his own. Just a man who had stood beside a black Maybach like a shadow without a name, and had finally, at the right cost and in the right time, stepped fully into the light of it.